American soldiers have been captured in Asia, and they're being marched toward the prison camps run by the Axis powers. They know the routine. They've been briefed on what to do when they become prisoners of war in basic training. They know to give the enemy as little information as possible and hold out for the end of the war. They also know that the Geneva Convention offers them certain protections, but they're about to find out in the harshest way possible that those protections no longer apply, because their Japanese captors will become known as among the worst war criminals in human history, and Allied prisoners are shown no mercy. These are some of the worst torture methods used by the Japanese during World War II. The Japanese gained a reputation as the worst country to be held captive by during the Second World War. Unlike in past wars where both sides generally respected their enemies' captives out of self-interest, so their own captives would get the same treatment, the Axis showed no such mercy. And while German POW camps were notoriously brutal, the Nazis reserved their worst treatment not for the POWs, but for their own citizens and conquered subjects that they deemed less than human. Imperial Japan, however, ran a massive network of camps that committed many of the worst atrocities of the war theater, and it so often began before the prisoners even arrived at the camps. For prisoners of war of Japan, the capture was part of the torture. During the early days of the war, the majority of prisoners were captured in the Southeast Asian theater, particularly in the incredible, brutal series of battles in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. From there, they'd be transported to the large prison camps built on the islands. To get there, they'd have to experience extended large-scale forced marches that would push captured soldiers to their breaking point, with many suffering from starvation, dehydration, and exhaustion. And this was the first preview of how little the Japanese valued the lives of their prisoners. In what would become known as the Bataan Death March in April 1942, the surrendered American and Filipino troops, numbering over 75,000, were stripped of their possessions. Any who were found to have contraband were immediately shot, a flagrant violation of the laws of war. From there, the troops, many sick, weakened, or injured, were organized into a march to camps as much as 65 miles away. Along the way, the Japanese troops would periodically show kindness, but there would be outbursts of violence, such as officers being randomly executed. And as the march went on, it was clear the prisoners were receiving little food or water. Exposure to the brutal elements were quickly wearing them down, and the slightest mistake or defiance meant death. Asking for water could get a prisoner killed on the spot. Prisoners were stripped or taunted with water. Anyone who hit the ground or slowed down was shot or bayoneted. Beatings were common, and by the time the surviving prisoners arrived at their destination, many were deathly ill. It's believed that as many as 18,000 Filipinos died during the march, and as many as 650 American troops. The final stage of the journey was transport in boiling metal boxcars to Camp O'Donnell, and those who didn't make it were buried in mass graves. Almost a third of the massive march's captives didn't make it to their final destination. This was the most famous death march, but it was far from the only one. These marches were a common feature of the Japanese war machine, with the Sandakan death marches on Borneo taking place during 1942 and 1943. These would become known as the worst atrocities suffered by Australian servicemen during the war, with only 6 surviving among a group of thousands, all of whom were transferred repeatedly from camp to camp. Most died due to malnutrition and abuse from the prison guards. Those who didn't met their end in eventual mass executions. But for those who survived the initial transfers, even worse atrocities awaited them, because the prisoners of war weren't treated as captives, they were treated as slaves. Japan was a relatively new empire, growing exponentially during the years leading up to the war. That meant they continued to build up their infrastructure during the war, and now they had a ready and unwilling supply of laborers for most dangerous jobs. The Geneva Convention strictly prohibits prisoners of war being used for slave labor, but that had been thrown out of the window long ago. So the American and other Allied troops were forced to participate in a twisted, ironic ritual, building the very infrastructure that was used against their fellow soldiers. And these workplaces were definitely not up to code. There were 3 primary areas where prisoners of war were put to work. The first was wartime infrastructure, heavy-duty projects such as building runways. This would be accomplished with the barest of possible equipment, such as manual tools to clear rocks and till the fields that could then be turned into runways. This was back-breaking work, with multiple men needed to lift very heavy loads. The primary risks were exhaustion, dehydration, and the constant threat of violence from their captors if they fell behind on quotas. And it may have been the least nightmarish position. Factory work was another common use for prisoners of war under World War II Japan, and anyone who's worked factory-type jobs know there are serious risks even under the best of conditions. This type of work usually required precise and steady hands, as well as a good amount of training. Japanese forced labor practices meant the soldiers, who were often working on munitions and other military supplies, were working with heavy and molten metal along with explosive materials, all while facing the omnipresent threat of being executed if they failed to meet their quota. And the final labor position was one that is terrifying even for those volunteering. Mining is a dangerous job, and everyone has heard the horror stories of miners trapped deep underground. The job is risky when done with safety equipment, and the unfortunate POWs tasked with keeping Japan well stocked with ore found themselves faced with a much worse scenario. Mining operations were often little more than being lowered into the mine in an iron bucket, and shafts were unventilated, and the ore was almost unbearably hot. It was the one forced labor detail most likely to wear down a laborer, and that meant instant death as soon as they were no longer useful. But it wasn't the work detail the prisoners had to fear the most. Often it was the guards. It's a common thing in prisoners, not all guards are created equal. One might just be looking to punch in their time on the clock and get home, and won't cause you any trouble if you don't cause him trouble. Another might actually be a nice guy, and you can get a few extra privileges if you play nice. And another might be looking to take out that frustration about never making the police force on the skulls. Prisoners quickly learn their way around the guards, but all of them are required to abide by certain laws regarding the rights of prisoners, even if they don't always live up to that. But in Japanese POW camps, there were no such regulations. In fact, brutality was often encouraged by the brass, and that encouraged monsters like the one known as the Bird. Okay, that's not exactly a terrifying name, but anyone who snickered at the name of Mutsuhiro Watanabe would soon live to regret it. Watanabe, who served at multiple military internment camps in Japan, was notorious for his sadistic treatment of prisoners, including Olympic runner Louis Zamperini, who was responsible for exposing much of Watanabe's crimes after the war. Watanabe was a student of nihilist philosophy and believed that creating fear was the most effective way to control a camp. He was known for his extreme punishments for minor offenses or no offenses at all. At one point, an elderly prisoner was tied to a tree for days as a warning, and in the dead of winter, an American officer was kept outdoors wearing only a single undergarment as he came close to freezing to death. And at times, the punishments resembled a twisted game more than anything else. Zamperini received a special kind of torment from the Bird, who was delighted at the idea of being able to torture an American hero. At one point, the star runner was forced to compete in a race against a Japanese officer. Coming off a harrowing lost-at-sea ordeal, Zamperini couldn't compete and was promptly beaten. In a later incident that became the most famous scene in the film adaptation of Zamperini's ordeal, the soldier was punished for a slight lapse during work duty by being forced to lift a heavy wooden beam for an extended period. If he dropped it, he would be shot. The ordeal only ended when Zamperini's refusal to fail enraged Watanabe enough to begin beating him again. These actions were clearly all far outside the bounds of acceptable wartime behavior, but the authorities in charge didn't care. This was all standard issue behavior for Imperial Japan, but they had far worse in store for all those who challenged them. Interrogations were a common part of any prisoner of war situation, as the captors hoped to get whatever information they could out of enemy soldiers. This was usually a pretty routine affair. The interrogator demands information, the soldier repeatedly says only the limited information they've been told to give out, and the captors hope that fear and exhaustion will win out and cause the captor to slip up. Most interrogators are hesitant to resort to any extreme measures because that would violate the Geneva Convention. But that wasn't an issue here. Japanese interrogators were infamous for brutalizing the soldiers they interrogate, hoping to break them more through pain and fear than through frustration and confusion. This included pulling out fingernails or using a twisted form of waterboarding that posed a much larger risk to the victim. The soldiers would place a tube down the prisoner's throat and turn on the water until the water flowed back out through the victim's nostrils. Not only did this simulate drowning, but it put the prisoner at risk of death from water intoxication. The goal of these interrogations was to leave the soldier tormented but alive and ready to divulge important information. That wasn't always the case. The Japanese army was infamous for mass executions, with huge percentages of their prisoners of war not surviving to the end of the conflict. The quickest way to die was simply to not be useful to the captors anymore. Slowing down on a march or collapsing during work duty usually meant a quick bullet to the head or a bayonet to the stomach. But that wasn't the case for those who defied the Japanese soldiers or were caught planning an escape. They wanted them to die, but they also wanted them to suffer. And they wanted everyone to watch. The executions of POWs and other prisoners were notoriously horrific under the Japanese rule, with many reports stating that they even engaged in crucifixion. one of the latest uses of this infamous execution method. Reportedly, the victims were simply nailed to anything that was convenient, including trees, wooden boards, or electrical posts, and left to die either from blood loss, infection, or exposure. This wasn't the only case where Japanese soldiers left the victims on display, but other cases displayed an innovative level of sadism. Hanging is one of the most common execution methods, but it's usually used to provide a quick death via the neck snapping. That wasn't how the Japanese used this execution method, instead preferring to let people hang and slowly asphyxiate. Often the target would be hung by something unconventional, the thumbs or even the tongue, and would be left to hang until the body part simply detached in horrifying fashion. A similar tactic took advantage of nature. One of the most disturbing Japanese torture methods was the bamboo cage, often used in rural prison camps and during marches. Bamboo is one of the fastest growing plants in nature, sprouting several inches per day, and can be filed into a sharp tip. The Japanese would place their captives over a bed of sharpened bamboo sticks and watch as they grew day by day, at first causing painful wounds as they grew and eventually impaling the captive and slowly killing them. It was one of a number of brutal but slow murder methods used by the Japanese soldiers. However, it wasn't the soldiers who delivered the worst types of torture, it was the scientists. One of the most infamous names of the war was the Nazi mad scientist, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the sadistic torturer who took Jewish captives and other prisoners of the Nazis and conducted twisted experiments on them. He killed many people and left countless others scarred and forever changed. He became a household name, especially after he disappeared without ever facing justice. But he may not have been the worst mad scientist of the war. A collective of twisted Japanese experimenters might have eclipsed him. This is the terrifying story of Unit 731. Officially named Manchu Detachment 731 and known as the Kamo Detachment, Unit 731 was officially a research division specializing in biological and chemical warfare, both of which were outlawed under the Geneva Convention. But this wasn't a deterrent to Imperial Japan, and they were no doubt hoping to unleash new and contagious weapons on the Americans if they were forced to invade the Japanese mainland. But when dealing with volatile and contagious compounds, research is key to ensure the unit didn't create a chain reaction they couldn't control, and they had plenty of unwilling subjects. The unit actually preceded the war, with Japan seeing the ban on chemical and biological weapons and deciding that obviously meant that they were so effective they needed to double their research into it. So in the early 1930s, Imperial Japan, which was already gearing up for war, authorized the military unit and set it up in Jungma Fortress, a prison camp used during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This camp was always filled with common criminals and political prisoners, and they were subjected to starvation and experimentation that often proved fatal. It was just a small preview of the sadistic treatment that awaited the prisoners of war who found themselves in the hands of Unit 731. The unit continued its experiments, repeatedly shocking even Hideki Tojo, who found looking at details of it unpleasant. This was not sufficient to make him stop it, though, and a side division codenamed Maruta, specialized in human experiments, was still created, and there seemed to be no limit to the depravity of the scientists in the unit, performing experiments without regard for the survival of their subject or even of any scientific benefit. While many of the experiments were focused on developing new weapons, others just seemed to exist to fulfill the sadists' curiosity, and many of the experiments were as simple as an injection. As anyone who's ever gotten their vaccines knows, a shot is never pleasant. But it's what's in that syringe that makes all the difference, and often the injections from the Japanese brought only death. This was during the days when blood transfusions were still relatively new, and the Japanese scientists were running short on blood for battlefield transfusions. They wanted to see if substitutes would suffice, so they gave prisoners injections of horse blood. Naturally, the two don't mix and the patients died. Another experiment sought to replace plasma with seawater, and the result was once again a quick death. But it was far from the worst thing that a treatment could bring. The Japanese were interested in biological warfare, and the best way they could think to test how dangerous specific diseases were was to inject people deliberately. Prisoners were repeatedly infected with syphilis and gonorrhea, two infamous sexually transmitted diseases, through various disturbing means. While both diseases can be treated or mitigated today, the Japanese weren't interested, instead watching them rip through the population and cause horrible discomfort and sometimes death. But it was far from the worst use of biological warfare by the Japanese army. Sexually transmitted diseases could be tested in limited numbers within the camp, but when it came to fast-spreading diseases like cholera and anthrax, they wanted a larger test group. So they bred fleas that were infected with the diseases and drop them on civilian villages in occupied China. Sometimes these plagues would decimate the towns, which were already suffering from malnutrition during the war and occupation, resulting in as many as 30,000 deaths. But disease could only do so much. The Japanese wanted to test the limits of human endurance too. Much of Unit 731 was seeing just how much the human body could endure. With plenty of human test subjects, this was the perfect time to see how far the human body could go. Some of these involved new technology. They were curious about how much pressure the human body could handle, so they put prisoners in high-pressure chambers and turned the pressure up until the prisoners suffered fatal injuries. A similar experiment was done with centrifuges, spinning the prisoners until their bodies gave out in a twisted experiment akin to a carnival ride from hell. And the same went for weapons testing. Brutality until death. The Japanese military was testing a large array of weapons for close-quarters combat they were preparing for, and the favored testing method was to simply take an unfortunate prisoner and use the weapon on them. This included grenades, flamethrowers, and bombs of all kinds, including chemical weapons, shrapnel bombs, and even bayonets and knives. While this did give data on whether the weapon would be effective in combat, the main conclusion seemed to be, yep, they're dead, which makes it feel more like an exercise in senseless sadism. But other experiments seem to be driven by a twisted form of curiosity. For these prisoners taken into a private lab rather than a field test, their death was likely to be slower and more painful. Among the experiments these prisoners experienced were repeated exposure to high levels of radiation through X-rays, waiting to see how long it would take to fatally poison them. Just about every type of poison imaginable was tested on the captives, including pufferfish venom, mustard gas, ricin, and heroin. One particularly twisted experiment involved draining mass amounts of blood from victims to see how it affected them and how long it took for them to expire. The same was done with dehydration, where the subjects were deprived of water and subjected to brutally hot conditions. Other experiments were designed to see how much it took to break the human body, literally. During the brutally cold periods of the war, Japanese scientists took part in a cruel frostbite test, where they would take the captives outside in the winter, dip their appendages into water and allow it to freeze solid. They would then take a stick and attempt to break the limb clean off, seeing whether it was frozen solid. This was overseen by Army engineer Hisato Yoshimura, known for being one of the cruelest experimenters in the unit. After this part, the limbs would often be thawed by exposure to fire. Most of the experiments were designed to end in death, but some dragged out the deaths longer than others. One of the most feared fates in Unit 731 was vivisection, the process of dissecting a living subject. This is a highly controversial practice when done with animals, never mind humans. While racist doctors around the world often performed medical procedures on slaves without proper anesthetic, a horrifying prospect, the Axis powers were fond of seeing how long the human body could hold out while being slowly taken apart, and these experiments pushed the bounds of human survival. While some of the most famous victims of Unit 731 were captured soldiers, the vast majority of prisoners at the facility were Chinese prisoners of war, which included large numbers of women and children. None of them were safe from this horrific treatment, which included whole organs or limbs being removed while the subjects were still alive and conscious. This included having samples of the liver or even the brain removed, or to remove the stomach and link the esophagus with the small intestine. None of these procedures were likely to result in surviving patients naturally, but there was always another prisoner to experiment on, and sometimes an experiment had more than one victim. Unit 731 had a particular interest in pregnant women and understanding the process of fetal development, which included infecting pregnant women with syphilis to determine if the disease could be passed from mother to child. Much like Dr. Mengelé's twisted lab, children were not spared from sadistic treatment, and that included the unborn. Details of these experiments only came out after the war, but the atrocities of Unit 731 were considered among the absolute worst of World War II. And even as the war was coming to a close, these atrocities continued. As the Japanese became more and more desperate, they became more and more willing to resort to incredibly cruel behavior on the battlefield. One of the best reports of this apparently happened in the Pacific Theater, where supplies were running low. As food dwindled, Japanese officers reportedly would select prisoners of war and designate them as food. The prisoner would typically be slaughtered and their meat served to the soldiers, but in some cases meat was sliced off a living prisoner. While this was initially an act of desperation, some officers began to like the climate of fear it created among the prisoners. And toward the end of the war, the Japanese seemed to be ready to just cause as many casualties as possible. The Japanese would load as many POWs as possible on ships, nicknamed Hell ships. where as many as 1,600 men would be shoved into a space meant for 500. These packed ships would then be sent to other camps, but they would be frequently hit by friendly fire, sinking the entire ship to a watery grave. Reports indicate that the men trapped in cages on board would be screaming for air and water, and the Japanese would often respond by covering up the cage, hastening the suffocation of the victims. And the true horrors of the war wouldn't come to light until well after the fact. While the Japanese were forced into unconditional surrender and the camps were liberated, only then did it become clear the terrible shape most of the captives were in. Years of malnutrition, hard labor, abuse, torture, and experimentation left their marks on the victims, horrifying the liberators in a similar way to the shock that awaited the GIs when they liberated the Nazi camps in Europe. The total of the dead at these camps will never be fully known, as documentation of the countless Chinese POWs is spotty, but it's believed that 27,465 U.S. military personnel were captured by Japan, and over 11,000 of them died. This is compared to 93,941 U.S. military members captured by Germany, with a death rate of just over 1,100. Needless to say, there would be payback. In the aftermath of the war crimes trials started to be formed to make the architects of the Axis powers' war crimes pay. While the Nuremberg trials, which targeted the worst Nazi war criminals, got the most publicity, the U.S. also prosecuted many of the Japanese forces' top criminals, and the results were similar. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East had a broader scope than the Nuremberg trials, dating back to Japan's 1931 invasion of Manchuria. And while in Germany, Hitler and many of his top lieutenants were dead, here current and former prime ministers were put on trial, and many of them met the ultimate fate. The trials lasted until 1948, far longer than Nuremberg, and in the end over 900 accused war criminals were executed. Most famously, this included Prime Minister and infamous General Hideki Tojo. However, it did not include the masterminds behind Unit 731, as the United States intervened and kept most of those details from the tribunal, rendering it one of the darkest secrets of World War II. The true horrors of the unit and many tortures of those who found themselves in the captivity of Imperial Japan would not come out for many years. Want to know more about the darkest secrets of World War II? Check out what actually happened to Nazi war criminals after World War II for all the dirty details, or check out the seawater torture, Nazi camp experiments for one of the war's darkest chapters.